Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program. On today's show, the war with Mexico and the U.S. shutdown with our guest, Scott Patrick, political analyst. Scott Patrick, a warm welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Jorge.
Scott, try to explain us, if you were talking to an audience that do not live in the U.S., why in the mass media on the U.S. the issue of the border between the U.S. and Mexico and migrants coming from Central America starts at the moment that the migrants crosses the border, and at all the U.S. public is aware or being informed of what is the reality in Central America and how much interference has the U.S. policies to create or generate those programs.
Well, there's a huge, long history of interference by the United States in Central America, going all the way back to our President James Monroe, who set up the Monroe Doctrine, which basically declared that all of Latin America and the Western Hemisphere essentially was the domain of the United States. And so the United States has regularly intervened in places like Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, either directly through sending in Marines or indirectly through intelligence operations. Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, which is primarily where the refugees are coming from.
The Northern Triangle.
The Northern Triangle, right. Two of those countries, El Salvador and Guatemala, were ravaged by civil wars, which had the handprints of the United States all over them as part of Cold War, an agenda to try to prevent the growth of left-wing or communist governments in Central America. Ever since the rise of the Castro government in Cuba, the United States was very concerned about the Soviet Union gaining allies in this part of the world. And as a result, we, like I said, intervened very heavily in those countries. And as a result, many of those people came here, fled here, seeking better lives, as refugees have done so throughout history. But in the minds of many Americans, as Gore Vidal, a famous American intellectual, once said, we are the United States of amnesia. We don't remember, even though this was only in the 1980s. Like in my lifetime, I'm a millennial. In my lifetime, these policies were being enacted by the Reagan administration. And yet, I fear in the minds of many Americans, they don't know where these people are coming from. They probably assume, by people I mean Americans, very ordinary Americans, probably assume that they're Mexicans, even though, as we know, as your audience probably knows, Mexicans are very divided also about the refugees along the border.
And why do you believe that the U.S. public or the average American do not know? They do not know because the U.S. media do not report it, or because they feel comfortable to being ignorant of realities that could make the Americans look bad or look guilty?
I mean, I think it's a bit of both. I mean, I feel like ordinary Americans, I think everyone wants to have a romantic idea about their nation and their history. Even only going back, 30 or 40 years, they still want to think of the United States as a beacon of freedom and liberty and supporting self-determination of people around the world. Well, of course. I mean, if you look at the history, there's ample evidence to suggest that we have, in the Cold War alone, supported authoritarian dictatorships all over the world in the interest of maintaining our own interests and so-called security. But obviously these refugees do not present any kind of existential threat to the United States. Global warming and issues of this nature are far more ominous for our future than these poor refugees who are coming in. And what we also aren't talking about is how MS-13, for example, which is a common boogeyman used by President Trump.
The gangs.
Yeah, the gangs were created in Los Angeles prisons. They came here and were forced into these criminal gangs as a result of being imprisoned, then deported back to these countries, which again were ravaged by civil war and therefore had very little state capacity to deal with these organized crime gangs in their countries. And these people are therefore fleeing forces like MS-13 that again we sort of exported to those countries.
There's an issue also regarding trade. In the case, for example, of the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that President Trump wanted to change the name in order to be the hero of the new era. But during the NAFTA, first 10 years, the U.S. government subsidizing huge American corporations are putting the prices of some of the crops down in order to compete with Mexico. And that leaves 2.4 million agricultural workers in Mexico jobless. Some of them go to the city and they are displaced, the people of the city, or some of them comes directly to the U.S., meaning that the U.S. trade policy left more than 2 million Mexicans without job. Also, the U.S. is backing governments that govern for the rich and export the poor. Two things. So now you have Mexicans that they have no other choice than to hit north in order to try to survive, to eat. But now they cross the border with no papers, and it's being demonized. So they become the mother of all the problems. That is the preaching of Trump, brings drugs, they're rapists, they are bringing all type of diseases, and so on and so forth. My question is, isn't that perverse that they create the phenomenon of the modern slavery, and on top of that you satanize the slaves?
Oh yes, I mean it's terrible, it's awful, it should be criminal. Unfortunately, it has a long history going back to classic Victorian age colonialism of making the colonized hate themselves. Frantz Fanon, white mask, black skin, trying to the colonizers are trying to convince the colonized that it's for their own good that they're being dominated. And there's always been a current. It usually was on the far right in this country that saw or predicted a sort of invasion of non-white, specifically Mexican people, coming into this country and therefore, quote unquote, corrupting, some idea of a romantic, highly racist vision of America.
And talking about that, we have heard in the U.S. program 60 Minutes, one of the most respected journalism programs in the U.S. for about 20 or 30 years, the new rising star of the Democratic Party, 29 years old, from Puerto Rican origin, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, saying clearly, being asked if Donald Trump is a racist. And she said, of course he's a racist. Does it has to do with the fact to being demonizing Latins, because not only Central Americans coming through the border, if not Mexicans, if not everything coming down from Mexico, that they're putting in a situation of modern slavery for many, that this president has the background of, for many, to being a racist and representing the white supremacy basically agenda that is giving them a base of voters that supposedly make him win the election with the help of the Russians.
Right. Yeah, I mean, he definitely is a racist, using racist tactics to, gin up support in the United States. He and this movement, really, this broad far-right movement, the alt-right movement, if you want to call it that, have been appropriating this cultural symbolism of the far right in the United States. This, like I said, this very racist, also traditionally anti-federal government movement. And a big part of that is this very imagined crisis on the border, that there is this flood of rapist, criminal Mexicans coming into the United States. Of course, it isn't true. The states with the highest concentration of undocumented Mexican immigrants are somehow some of the lowest violent crime rates. But it exists in their imagination, right? And like you said, it's used to gin up support for this highly conservative agenda. And the border wall is very expensive. Talking about $6 billion potentially. Red meat being thrown to the people who believe in this movement. And the mere fact that it's even a question that Trump is racist, for using these racist tactics, for characterizing Mexicans, specifically Mexicans, as, as a group, as being rapists, as being somehow deviant or criminal, that is quintessential racism. If that isn't racism, I don't know what it is,
So do you think that he's on to end up declaring a national emergency in order to bypass the Congress and, quote unquote, build the wall through the funds of the Defense Department?
I don't think he wants to bring on another constitutional crisis on top of everything else that he's facing now. I feel like he realizes that if he tried to do that in this current political climate, it would be so controversial and so damaging to an already heavily damaged administration. It would just give him more frustration. I feel like he's already probably feels like he's bit off more than he can chew right now.
We have seen him talking through a national address this past week, and he said that before that speech, at midday he met with anchors, TV anchors, having lunch with them, and he's supposed to confess, if you want, saying that I was not really believing that I had to give that speech. I do not think that I have to go and visit the border. But they push me, my advisors push me to do. Is he really running his show, or these very strict policies that he doesn't want to change his position is being dictated by the far right of his constituency?
I mean, I think he realizes that he can't possibly go forward without that constituency, and he feels like he has to give them something on this wall. And it's clear he's already backing down from the claim, the famous claim that he was going to make Mexico pay for the wall. Why else would he be making the government shut down if Mexico was paying for it? So he feels like if he doesn't get the wall or the slats, the famous steel slats that have been proposed, then it'll be such a catastrophic failure for his support that.
And he could mix or lose elections in 2020?
Oh yes, yes.
So his life of that in his mind to win this, if you win, battle.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like he out of pride, even if he realizes it's not realistic that he's going in as the underdog, he probably wants to go out there feeling like, yes, I kept these promises. I don't believe he's a true believer, but I do believe he's worried about his legacy, just as a narcissistic personality. He wants to, even if he goes down, he wants to be remembered for having done something, even if it is this, monument to racism.
We continue to talk to Scott Patrick, our political analyst. Scott, a new Congress here in Washington for 2019, the most diverse Congress in history, more than 100 women and mostly of minorities represented. Is that going to have an impact in what we're going to see in politics for the next 2 years before the next presidential election?
I mean, that's an interesting question because there has been a spike, if you will, in women especially getting more involved in politics in the United States since the election of Trump, who was famously caught on tape, the locker room talks about sexual assault. And that's motivated a lot of women, and of course the conservative bent of the Supreme Court in the United States now too, and what that means to reproductive rights in the United States. So there's a lot of concern, I feel, among women in this country about the direction of the country, and that's led to a lot of more women getting involved in politics. Unfortunately, unless the Democratic Party does things like quotas and tries to push more women being involved, I'm not sure if this is just a blip or not. I do hope that the future Congress and both parties are more diverse going forward, both in terms of gender and ethnic identity.
But in terms of Trump pushing his agenda, it's going to be much complicated now that the majority of the House of Representatives is in the hands of the opposition, of the Democratic Party?
I mean, I would think so. I mean, it didn't seem like there was a whole lot of momentum behind his agenda when both House and the Senate were controlled by his own party. Because he's had so many antagonists within his own party, within the Republicans, for the last several years. But yes, now that the House is in the hands of the Democratic Party, it's pretty much a non-starter that there's going to be any meaningful moving forward until 2020.
There's an agreement in Washington among all the experts that immediately after the midterm elections, the campaign for the presidential 2020 has already started, and some of the possible candidates within the Democratic Party has already announced, for example, the case of Elizabeth Warren. What do you think about the candidates? And talk to me about fractures or possible fractures within the Democratic Party?
I mean, there's a huge fracture. Some would even say maybe of a civil war within the Democratic Party in the United States right now. That many saw the 2016 primarily between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders as sort of the opening stages of that conflict. Sanders representing the more far left, at least by American standards, or U.S. standards rather, politics, and Hillary Clinton representing sort of the status quo, centrist, middle of the road approach. And even though Sanders had a very huge movement behind him and continues to do so, and the election of Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez representing the Bronx, she's also become a progressive darling, if you will. But you don't see the Democratic Party nationally moving any further to the left. If anything, you're seeing Joe Biden, who is as much a representation of establishment.
Former Vice President.
Right, former Vice President under Barack Obama, also a longtime U.S. Senator from Delaware. Very much an icon of the establishment as Hillary Clinton was and is.
So who you think is going to be ended up being the winner of those sort of friction?
I'm hoping very much that the Sanders-Elizabeth Warren wing of the party emerges successfully. I don't think even they really have the bold reforms, or some would say even revolutionary agenda necessary to sort of address a lot of the problems that the United States is facing. But I would definitely see them as a marked improvement from, again, the status quo that we've been getting on issues like climate change, the economy, income inequality, and racism, institutional racism in the United States.
When you live here in the U.S., and the manipulation of words and minds, for example, the right, or the Republicans mostly, tends to play with the word regulations like the boogeyman, something really bad. And in reality, a regulation is a protection. For example, if they regulate something that has to do with climate change, basically those regulations are protecting the majority of the population of the US. And it's same things in commerce and same things in social issues. When there is a candidate or there is a politician that is very much concerned about protecting the majority of the population, meaning trying to demand regulations, they immediately label, like in the blacklist, and they put the label of socialist / communist, and that means that you are really, really, really bad because you are trying to protect the people. And the idea here is to protect the capital. If you protect the capital, or the capitalism, that is basically the hardware of the country, the hardcore, you're doing okay. If you are not protecting the 99% of the population, you are a communist, you're a socialist, and therefore, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Elizabeth Warren, or Bernie Sanders are really bad people because they do not protect the capital. They are more interested to protect the people. Why that is not getting a counter reaction in terms of fighting the public opinion or the presence in the media of the other side of the story?
I feel like, I mean, there is sort of a spectacle, if you will, around people like Bernie Sanders or Ocasio-Cortez. They've sort of become, in our media especially, we like personalities. We don't talk about the issues or policies or things like history. We like to talk about people and almost get like a cult going around them. And that's a problem because there's, for example, Ocasio-Cortez, there's so much scrutiny given to her. And so a lot of the media coverage you do see, for example, that 60 Minutes interview you mentioned, you know, Vanderbilt Anderson Cooper interviewing her very skeptically about things like how are you going to pay for Medicare for all or something like that, or how can you possibly say that Trump is racist when he says racist things? But we should hopefully try to get away from that. I feel like that shouldn't become the story that these people or this movement necessarily represents the only way forward. I mean, that's something that Trump said, was that I'm the only one that can fix things. We have to talk more about how do we as a society, as a culture, fix these issues and not put everything on a 29-year-old, Congress member from the Bronx like Ocasio-Cortez.
And there was an issue precisely in that part of the conversation of that interview with 60 Minutes that playing the role of the skeptical and Anderson Cooper, the interviewer, when the issue of taxing people, she mentions that she believes that should be taxed in a very heavy way, people that get income of 10 million and over.
Sure.
And the interviewer, playing the role of the defender of capitalism, start to aggressively say, but hold on a second, how are we going to pay for free education, free healthcare, free housing, and you see you're taxing the rich and blah, 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 blah. And her answer was very clear. She said, why don't you make me the same question, how the country is going to pay for increasing the military budget, how they're going to do reduction of taxes of the rich. That question is not asked. She says everything that we bring up, a social issue, basically as housing, education, and healthcare, you represented, the interviewer, you representing the capital, look very concerned, but you're not very concerned to spend money in military issues and make huge corporations make billionaire profits. So that issue is not brought regularly in the media. So when I'm saying, bottom line, is the U.S. a democracy?
No, I mean, in some ways we are increasingly an oligarchy. I mean, we still, I should say that we are a democracy in the sense that our votes do matter. Trump was not the establishment choice in 2016, so he is evidence that regular people do have influence on government and world politics even. However, the fact that even Trump is failing with such a huge populist movement behind him, the fact that previous governments, pretty much since FDR, have been unable to complete very ambitious agendas, suggests that there are very strong interests in this country. Just as, for example, multinational corporations or the military might represent strong institutions in many countries. Here, it is the military-industrial complex, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and the Pentagon and defense contractors working together with Congress to ensure that there's always going to be funding for fighter jets and aircraft carriers because they're assembled in every state. So if that was to be canceled, if spending was to be cut dramatically, there would be howls across the country because people would be losing jobs.
Regardless if it's necessary or not, the armament.
Oh yes, I mean, people have already, again, United States of Amnesia, we've already forgotten in 2010, Barack Obama set up the Simpson-Bowles Commission, a bipartisan commission to study how to cut the deficit, and something that they proposed was slashing the defense budget.
Ooh.
I know. And
dirty word.
Yeah, well, even though the deficit has been a dirty word in U.S. politics, the idea of cutting defense spending was even dirtier to many politicians that they didn't support the plan.
Who is winning the 2020 election?
Oh, wow. I mean, I would like to say Elizabeth Warren. I fear like Joe Biden is sort of the lesser evil, and then Trump is the worst possible choice. So I'll go with Biden as the safe bet, maybe.
Scott Patrick, thanks very much for joining us.